Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistic Society of America, and we're just going to take maybe 1 or 2 more minutes to allow the rest of our attendees to check in, and then we'll get started. So thanks for joining us, and I'll be back with you in a few moments. Okay, hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistic Society of America, the LSA, which is sponsoring this webinar. My pronouns are he, him. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. I hope that you and yours are staying safe and healthy. I'd like to acknowledge that expanded access to this webinar is supported by the National Science Foundation under grant number 1924593. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of the presenters and authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. While I'm talking, you'll be seeing a brief slideshow about the LSA and what we do. You'll also see some information about a special membership discount for participants in this webinar. We're excited to present this webinar on This is Linguistics, Scope, Positionality, and Graduate Apprenticeship when Diversifying the Linguistics Curriculum. This is the third in a planned series of webinars on racial justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the linguistics curriculum. We're grateful to our panelists for taking the time to participate and to you for being here. And our panelists, as you have seen, are DeAndre Miles-Hercules, Jamal Muwakil, and Kendra Calhoun, all of the University of California, Santa Barbara. I want to take just a few moments before we get started to let you know how the webinar will work and to make sure you're familiar with the control panel. If you'd like to download copies of the panelists' slides, you will find those in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar dashboard. They're also available on our resource page for this webinar, and I'll be sending around a link to that page afterwards. It will also have a recording of the webinar. You may also have noticed that your microphones are muted. This is so we don't get miscellaneous background noise from several hundred different participants. We do encourage you to ask questions at any time. There's a questions widget that you can use for that purpose, and panelists will answer questions during the last half hour of the webinar. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please let us know which one. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to our first speaker, DeAndre Miles-Hercules. And DeAndre, take it away, and I will allow you to share your screen momentarily. Okay.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you for that introduction, David. As you said, I'm DeAndre Miles Hercules, and I'll be joined by my colleagues Jamal Mawakil, Kendra Calhoun. Welcome to This is Linguistics, Scope, Positionality, and Graduate Apprenticeship when Diversifying the Linguistics Curriculum. Before we get started, I just want to note that if you are tweeting or live tweeting this webinar, you can use the hashtag #ThisIsLinguistics to keep that kind of connection going. So without further ado, I'll start off with scoping the scope, revisiting the aims and paradigms of linguistics. I'll start by introducing myself with a little bit of background. I'm a sociocultural linguist, among many other hats that I wear. As you can see, I'm photographed wearing my linguist hat from Prince George's County, Maryland. And I went to Emory University where I got a BA in linguistics with focuses in African American studies and anthropology, after which I started off at UCSB where I just finished the MA portion of the PhD program. And I mostly study a broad range of things regarding the linguistic construction and performance of race, gender, and sexuality.
And DeAndre, sorry for interrupting. Can you turn your cam on? We can't see you.
Oh, sorry. I did not realize that. Can you see me now?
There you are.
Perfect. This is me. As I was saying, I study broadly race, gender, and sexuality with regard to language. And that is exactly what I will not be talking to you about today. Why am I here today? For one, I'm going to kind of engage with the field's renewed interest in talking about diversity and inclusion, which we might call more specifically challenging white supremacy in the discipline, specifically in the wake of the national rebellions that were instigated by police murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, among others, many, many, many others. And I also seek to ask you the question, Professor Ann Charity Hudley often jokes that when I'm asking about what the efficacy of linguistics is, my framework is always, why are y'all doing this, right? What is the function of linguistics, which is something I hope to speak to today. I hope to scope the scope of linguistics, and this idea of scope is going to continually come back up, and so it's something I really want to be able to key into. And then at the end of this whole thing, I will ask, as Audre Lorde does when she says that I'm myself a warrior poet doing my work, come to ask you, are you doing yours? So I think it'll actually be instructive to start off with the story of how myself became a linguist that might help to kind of couch some of this discussion. And so this actually starts with Zora Neale Hurston, who, for those who aren't familiar, is an anthropologist and author, folklorist, among other things. She studied at Barnard College of Columbia University under Franz Boas. She wrote the book Their Eyes Were Watching God. She collected the life histories of formerly enslaved people with the Works Progress Administration's project in the 1930s and 40s. She's an all-around dope human being. And it's one of the reasons, as you'll see, that I got into linguistics. This is a photo of her. And this passage comes from an essay called How It Feels to Be Colored Me, published in 1928, that I first came across in an AP language and composition course when I was in the 11th grade at Bladensburg High School, which again is in Prince George's County, Maryland. And immediately preceding this passage, Hurston describes an interaction where she goes to a jazz club with a white man, and the band has just played a rousing routine. I mean, the band is bumping, right? And she writes about how engaged she was and how this music really took her to a faraway land somewhere on the African continent, and how it just really kind of set her senses ablaze. And she turns to her companion who says, good music they have here. And this passage is her response. Music. The great blobs of purple and red emotion have not touched him. He has only heard what I felt. He is far away, and I see him but dimly across the ocean and the continent that have fallen between us. he is so pale with his whiteness then, and I am so colored. And so I provide this as an example of the thing that made me deeply fascinated by language. I saw language then as music, as emotion, as passion, as gesture, as embodiment, as instrumentality. And that was the thing that told me, yes, I want to and am going to study language at some level or another. I had no idea what linguistics was. I'm a first generation college student. My parents, in fact, didn't know what linguistics is and had no earthly reason to, for that matter. But I ended up matriculating into Emory, not knowing again what linguistics was, but I stumbled across Linguistics 101, History of the American Languages. It was taught by Susan Chomsky, and it was a dope class. And I use that word specifically because I remember that we had an assignment that was to look up the etymology of a word on the Oxford English Dictionary and to write an essay about that history. And I, coming from a context deeply saturated by hip hop culture, I was really interested at the time in the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, which is a phenomenal album. If you haven't listened to it, you should go do so immediately after this webinar. But I looked at the history of the word dope, and in that essay, I was able to see that my cultural context could be deeply engaged in how I studied linguistics or how I came to learn what linguistics was. So I'm super thankful for Susan for that. She's pictured here. She's very nice. And another thing that kind of provided that aha moment for me, which I came across in the same time I was taking this course, was this video, which some of you may have also seen, called 3 Ways to Speak English by Professor Jamila Lyscott, who's at UMass Amherst. And she gave this TED Talk, which I also would recommend you watch the whole thing, which is about her experiences speaking 3 different varieties of what she calls English, which might be called a Jamaican Creole English, an African American English, and a hegemonic American vernacular English. And so this excerpt kind of gets at all these different perspectives on those 3 varieties. So I'll go ahead and play this excerpt.
So when my professor asks a question and my answer is tainted with the connotation of urbanized suggestion, there's no misdirected intention. Pay attention, because I'm articulate. So when my father asks, what kind of thing is this? My articulate answer never goes amiss. I say, Father, this is the impending problem at hand. When I'm on the block, I switch it up just because I can. So when my boy says, what's good with you, son? I say, I just fall out with them people, but I gun.
And so when I look at this, I see phonetics, phonology, syntax, pragmatics, all the levels of linguistic structure I was being taught in that very first class to look at as within the purview of linguistics. But I also saw this as deeply connected to and in relation to that passage from Zora Neale Hurston, right? Again, that my cultural context could be embedded in how I was approaching the study of language. And it is not lost on me, as I imagine it won't be on many of you, that this is the kind of data, as it were, that you certainly would not see in a traditional or typical linguistics course, outside of potentially a sociolinguistics course. But even then, maybe not, depending on what the paradigm one is working from is. And again, in addition to all of these levels of linguistic structure, I also saw embodiment, alliteration and poetics, pedagogy. She's a teacher by trade, geography, when she's talking about the block and how she's linguistically constructing it. These are the things that made me say, yes, I'm going to become a linguist. This is going to be my profession. And so that really leads me to go back to what the aims of linguistics are. And I'm drawing this part of the title specifically from a general course in linguistics, chapter 2, which is titled The Data and Aims of Linguistics. And so here I'm going to talk about Ferdinand de Saussure, one, because he is the most frequently cited as the founder of modern linguistics, which is not to say he is or should be the sole arbiter of what linguistics is, but because of his historical standing in the field, I'm going to go back to some of the ideas that he had, but also as spoken through his students who compiled his notes into the book, Course in General Linguistics, and the translator, Roy Harris. And so they ask, of what use is linguistics, which is also something we're going to come back to. But one thing they were sure to note is that for the study of language to remain solely the business of a handful of specialists would be quite an unacceptable state of affairs. And I would suggest to you that if Saussure was able to page through the abstract booklet of an LSA meeting, he might be turning in his Swiss grave, because it appears to me that that is exactly, in some sense, what linguistics has become over the course of time. He also argued that language is the subject that has actually fostered the most absurd notions and prejudices, illusions, and so forth about society and the human capacity to interact. And that is the job and role of the linguist to denounce those things and to eradicate them, which is to say that it is the role and job of the linguist to engage in the broader society. Nevertheless, I will say again, which is why Saussure shouldn't necessarily be the paragon of what linguistics is that he is also in some level responsible for racism and white supremacy in linguistics. As you can see by this quote, he argued that the system of Sanskrit, which is the historical language spoken in the liturgical systems of what is now known as India, among other places, he argued that the vowel system specifically of Sanskrit was a primitive system when compared to Romance languages and Greek, which racism. I don't have to spell that out. And so we're borrowing from, one of his kind of successors of this European structuralism, moving into post-structuralism, that being Michel Foucault. I would argue that we need to excavate the field to unearth the commitment that, goes back over a century to see society outside of the ivory tower as the goal of interaction in linguistics, in addition to exposing that long-standing history of white supremacy. I'm also going to revisit the paradigm in talking about another well-known figure in linguistics. And I don't mean to get into or wade into the quagmire of politics of what people think about his work. I'm really going to be honing in on the structural realities of how he became a linguist, or how or why he's seen as a linguist, among other things. So this is Noam Chomsky. He's a laureate professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona, where I'm sure he is very, very grateful to be on the same faculty as Professor Sanja Langhart, who is a wonderful and accomplished human in their own right. But Chomsky, outside of being a linguist, is known primarily as a political activist and theorist. The vast majority of people, again, hearkening back to the quote by Saussure of the specialist nature of linguistics, most people don't know what linguistics is, but they do know that Chomsky is a political theorist, if they do know him at all. And so he is often wearing this hat, but not always. Again, he's known in this circle primarily as a linguist. But it's important to note for me that he actually came to linguistics vis-a-vis philosophy. So he went to Harvard at a time where Willard Van Orman Quine was one of his advisors, and he also studied with J.L. Austin, who's known for his speech act theory. He was a visiting scholar from philosophy at Oxford at the time, and worked with Chomsky very closely. I also would like to point out that the first article that Chomsky ever published was in a philosophy journal, the Journal of Symbolic Logic. And so there's another level at which philosophy kind of Chomsky enters this conversation as a philosopher. He also developed the language acquisition device, his way of thinking about where the human capacity, or uniquely human capacity, to develop language comes from, as a challenge to behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner at the time. So, Chomsky was also deeply engaging with what was going on in psychology and into the development of what's been called cognitive psychology or cognitive science. The reason I bring this thing up is that, or is to show that Chomsky is all of these things at once, and that interdisciplinarity has always been at the core of linguistics. It's always been welcome, even in the kind of arbiter of, or early arbiter of generativism, which is usually seen as the kind of monodisciplinary field or paradigm of linguistics. So thinking about how interdisciplinarity has always been a part of the paradigm. And here are just some additional examples. I think about how Zora Neale Hurston kind of served as a precursor for Lorenzo Dow Turner. He was a linguist who wrote extensively about the origin, development, and structure of Gullah language in the coastal Carolinas and the islands off the shore of Georgia and the Carolinas, who I also might argue is a precursor for someone like Professor Tracy Weldon, who is an associate professor of English language and literature and an associate dean at the University of South Carolina. I also imagine that it wouldn't be lost on anyone here of the close historical relationship between linguistics and anthropology. And I think this is no more clear than looking at Professor Marion Mithun, who is the current president of the LSA, but also served for many years on the AAA's executive committee, and also has served as the president of the Society for Linguistic Anthropology. And the last thing I'd like to point out is, Michael Tomasello, who is kind of the preeminent scholar of first language acquisition, who was working at the psychology department at Emory University, no less, in the 90s, as well as Deborah Vidali, who's in anthropology. That these people actually established the program in linguistics at Emory, which is to say that I myself would not be a linguist had it not been for the work of folks outside of the field, at least structurally, even though, they might be considered in other ways as linguists. And so in that way, interdisciplinarity comes full circle to how I even entered this conversation as a linguist. And I say all this to say that interdisciplinarity has, in some way or another, always been welcome in the field, but not always, right? There are limits. And this is what I'm here to talk about, or perhaps the most important things that I have to say in this talk, which is that linguists do continue to insist, in spite of that history of interdisciplinarity, that there are and should be very clear borders separating linguistics from other fields of study. Which is to say that interdisciplinarity is great until it centers the issues of marginalized folks, right? And so it just so happens, maybe it's a coincidence, some might say, that those lines often line up with the fields that historically encourage and in some sense require critical reflexivity on systems of power and oppression. Those being fields such as Black or African American studies, feminist studies, Chicanic studies, East Asian studies, queer studies, Native American and Indigenous studies, the list goes on and on. But the through line is that all of these fields require and center a focus on deconstructing and challenging these systems of power and oppression. For more on this, you can look at the forthcoming LSA statement, or the already published LSA statement on race, and forthcoming towards racial justice and linguistics paper. Another consequence of that is that many diverse students, by which I mean to say non-white or non-cisgender heterosexual and so forth, students who have a deep interest in language, as I did in those early days, reject linguistics for other fields because they see them as more receptive to the work that they find interesting. And when we lose those students, I then have to ask, well, do you care? Who cares about linguistics? And that is a question I pose to all linguists. And I further would ask, where is the merit in linguistics, again, harkening back to Saussures' original conception, that doesn't engage in the pressing social issues of our current and contemporary society outside of traditional academic avenues and paradigms? And so I would point out, as a consequence, that current public engagement with linguistics mostly focuses on socio-political issues of language, and not to target anyone or any subfield in particular, but you don't see people outside of the ivory tower interested in morphosyntax, for instance, typology, for instance, which is not to say that there isn't value in their subfields. I wouldn't be a linguist if I didn't think there was, but I also think it's important to hone in on the fact that if we are to truly develop linguistics as a publicly and socially engaged science, then we have to break out of those molds and encourage participation and engagement with the kinds of fields that encourage that sort of work. And so I have a surprise for you. Surprise, surprise, that these kinds of definitions of scope that exclude the interests of marginalized communities, such as those I've listed, is what white supremacy in linguistics looks like, which what I might reframe as if you don't want to reify and reinstantiate white supremacy in linguistics, then maybe reflect on and step back from those kind of anxieties about the scope of what linguistics is and isn't. And so moving forward, I have a few suggestions. One is that we ought to recognize that a hyper narrow conception of what linguistics is does an actual disservice to the field. It doesn't actually benefit us as linguists in any real tangible or meaningful way. This very, very narrow focus, such as I might liken to a microscopic one, is one that we should abhor and kind of push back against. I would suggest instead that we open our mind to the possibilities. As Professor Ann Charity Hudley has often said, linguistics is and can be the consummate liberal art in the way that it has the possibility to draw together all of the fields that we see evident in terms of analysis in that 3 Ways to Speak English video. And so I suggest in the final instance that we turn this microscope into a telescope, such that linguists might be able to see what we might currently think of as far off or distant objects of study as closer than they might appear. And at last, I will say, to quote Buzz Lightyear, to infinity and beyond. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Here's a long list of acknowledgements from people who have helped me on my journey to become a linguist. This is my family and the Black linguists in particular, who I'm very, very grateful for. I thank you for listening again. Here are my references. Thank you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Let's see if I can get this camera to show. Yep, there I am. And play. Can you see my slides?
Not right now.
Okay.
I saw them a minute ago.
Sharing. It says it's showing it to you.
I can see it now. It's not in the slideshow mode.
Right, so let's say if I do this, can you still see them?
No, they disappeared. So as a backup, I can run them from my computer if you like, Jamal. We'll just need verbal prompting from you.
That is unfortunate. Let me try once again. And if I do this, and if I do play, and it is white, that is terrible. Yes, sadly, that'll be how it has to go.
Okay, let me.
That's rough because there's so many button presses.
But I will, let's see. I have. Sorry, let's see. Can you see my screen?
I can. So if you go full screen, how does that work?
Yeah. Let me see. How do I go?
Oh, there's not, it's not gonna. Can I give it a shot one more time?
Sure. Just a moment. Okay, there you go, Jamal.
Let's say show this window. And if I go play, why do you do this? Well, we will have to rock with it. So let's see, what's the best way to go about this?
And let me,
Yeah, you may have to do it for me, and then I'll just cue you to proceed.
okay, I'll do that. I can get it up in full screen mode, and I will try to be proactive with the page turns, but just prompt me if you need to.
Absolutely, I will. I'll just say next.
Perfect. Okay, how's that? Can you see the screen?
I can see the screen, yes. It's not in full screen mode, however.
Now it is.
Yes, okay, great. So
Okay,
if we can, the initial page. Well, I can start from here. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My apologies for the technical difficulties. My name is Jamal Muwakil, and I use he, him pronouns. The presentation you're going to see is going to be focused on positionality in research, teaching, and curriculum. I am going to, the presentation that David is graciously helping me with is a PDF as opposed to a keynote or a slideshow. So I had them animated. You're not going to be able to see the animations. You're just going to see everything as it initially starts. So apologies for the lack of drama as compared to my great colleague, DeAndre Miles Hercules' presentation, but we'll get through it. Next, please, David. So as a general overview for what we're going to be discussing, I'm going to start off with an initial encouragement because some of the topics we're going to engage in are going to be a little heavier. I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am in particular, what positionality is, discuss a bit about the complexion of linguistics as a discipline, talk about the consequences of engaging or not engaging with positionality, and some parting encouragement to spur us on as we go forward together. Next, please. So as an initial encouragement, I really want to encourage us all to be reflective in this moment, right? So I'm going to be posing a fair amount of rhetorical questions. And because you're not able to engage in the chat such that we can see it, I would ask that you write them down either for yourself or for us in the Q&A, but try to answer them for yourselves, right? That yes, it is the case that sometimes we are discussing some of the woes and the fraught nature of the people out there, but sometimes we're also talking about the people in here. So let's put that mirror up to ourselves and be able to have strong answers to some of the tough questions that are going to be posed today. And also, just as a reminder, none of us have attained definitive social consciousness. None of us are at peak woke, and that's okay. It's all a journey, and we're taking that journey together. It's a process. So let's be okay with that. Next, please. All right. who am I? I identify as a cisgender, heterosexual, Black American man. I was originally from Compton, California, here in Southern California. It's the best city of all the cities. It's better than your city, fight me. I'm originally from a working class family. My father is a salesman and a photographer, and my mother is a tax preparer. I'm a first generation college student. I and the rest of my siblings have subsequently all graduated from different colleges. But our parents, my dad likes to remind us all that he did go to community college for a couple semesters. So thank you, Dad. I initially pursued academia as a means to make conditions better for the marginalized. Some of the marginalized folks are in this picture of my family, and my cute niece Emma, who's there. She'll turn 3 next week, so she's an old person now. So for them, they helped to shape me. They're also my motivation for doing this work. I also say, and for job security, I add LOL because after the pandemic, who knows what's going to happen. So yes, next please. Right, so positionality. What is positionality? It's one subject position, right? As a useful mechanism for understanding that you can think deixis, right? So deixis being the nature of language such that it's context dependent, that it points and it's subjective to the context specifically. So words like here, now, there, this, tomorrow, they're all relevant to where you are, who you are, and when you said that. So they necessarily kind of take into consideration the context. I'd also say that this kind of functions and interacts with conceptions of social normativity as well, such that something is normative in a frame. Something can be marked as it relates to that normative thing. We'll develop that as we go forward. Next, please. This would be cuter if there was animations, whatever. Your positionality informs your baseline assumptions. I cite Wittgenstein here as he engages in a great thought experiment about how to follow an arrow and the assumptions that goes into the idea of how to follow an arrow. If you are around all the people who know that an arrow points towards the head in this way, you wouldn't know that there's other ways to potentially read that sign unless another person came up and said, actually, there's more lines pointing away from it than towards it. And so that's kind of baseline forming my understanding. It shapes your positionality, shapes what can be seen, but also what can be seen as marked. Marked being seen as, the idea of general aberrance or difference. We are necessarily subject to the culture and society to which we are exposed, which is to say that we're not making decisions necessarily about our positionality all the time. That there's oftentimes given to us independent of our acknowledgement or our consent. The world is as it shapes us, and we are as the world has shaped us to a large degree. And due to that, no one has lived a single day outside of their own body except Dalton. This is a picture of Dalton. If you've ever seen the movie Insidious, it's about astral projection. So Dalton has lived a few days outside of his body, but no one else. Everyone else has been in their body, and their body has shaped the way that they see the world necessarily. Next, please. So linguistics is pretty white, yeah? Which is to say that many linguists are white. But would you know that by reading a linguistics article? If you were to read a linguistics article and they don't mark the positionality or the racial identity of the author, would you assume that they're white? It would be a safe bet for the most part. But in that case, do we take whiteness as a given? More specifically, if we're talking about praxis, would you assume that they would tell you if the author were non-white, such that the non-whiteness would be seen as relevant to their analysis maybe, or to their engagement, to the decisions, to the questions that they ask? So what non-whiteness would be relevant such that they should avow it, and whiteness is taken as given because it's an objective stance? These are questions. Under which conditions would a researcher's positionality not be relevant to the work that they produce is a question that I ask and would love for you to consider. This is, again, an inversion to the common question of under which conditions would a researcher's positionality be relevant? I would assert that it's always relevant, and it would challenge a person to tell me in which conditions it is not relevant, such that none of us has ever lived a day outside of our own body and are subject to those contexts and their interaction with society. Is linguistics context dependent? We talk about language phenomena as context dependent. Is linguistics context dependent? Does it matter who's doing what as a linguist? Can linguist A and linguist B do the exact same work with the exact same methods and the exact same theories, independent of the body that they occupy? These are questions. And which of us has an objective gaze? I would like to meet you if you do. Next, please. Additionally, there are not very many Black linguists in particular, nor Native linguists, actually, Indigenous linguists, but there are many Black and Indigenous scholars of language. This is interesting because many of the scholars of language are outside of, the Black scholars of language are outside of linguistics departments. As it stands, very few Black linguists actually exist within a linguistics department. Why do you think that is? Instead of broadly claiming, which is true, by the way, that systemic racism is at work, what does linguistics proper do to incentivize or disincentivize Black participation? Perhaps it interacts with this question of what is linguistics versus what is not linguistics. Is the answer to the question, what is linguistics, variable based on who's asking and who's responding? And then who ultimately is deciding what gets to be definitively linguistics versus outside of canonical linguistics? I might suggest that linguistics, the not linguistics topics in particular, can serve as an indexical proxy for race. An example, next please. Dress codes. So a lot of us have seen these types of dress codes, and pardon me, I blocked out the first phrase on the one on the right because it references domestic violence. It's a type of a shirt, but yeah, you get it. But I wasn't able to do that. So dress codes. These are dress codes for restaurants, dress codes for nightclubs. Dress codes serve a purpose, right? They say who is able to kind of come into the establishment to participate in the event and what have you based on their attire, right? Now, they're also supposed to be colorblind because to discriminate based on color for access to establishments would be against the law. But let's look at these items that are cited in some of these dress codes and see if they're maybe pointing to a type of person. So no gang wear, that's vague. Saggy pants, whatever saggy pants are. I think it's a blending of sagging and baggy. Flat billed hats. So curved billed hats are fine, but flat billed hats are not fine. Fascinating, right? The middle one is fascinating. CJ's Upper Deck says that hats, baseball caps only, and such that baseball caps, they can only be worn straight forward or straight backwards. So no off to the side, which is the way that I wear my hats, by the way. Looking a little below, no large logos, which is to say, i.e. South Pole, which is my favorite brand as a youth. No FUBU, Forest Bias, a Black brand, and no ghetto gear, whatever, again, ghetto gear is. It seems to be the case that some of the topics and the specific items that are selected, that are banned and prohibited from this establishment overlap with the types of clothes that certain types of people wear. In such a case, the establishment may be engaging in racial discrimination in a colorblind way. We can see a real world contemporary example of this in the Baltimore case, where a mother and son went to a restaurant, as we can see on the left, to get some food, and the folks that they met said that the son was in violation of the dress code and couldn't come in with the shorts that he was wearing. The mother, videotaping this interaction, turned to her left and saw that there was a little white boy in similar shorts who had been gained access and was not barred from eating at that fine establishment. Which is to say that sometimes the rules are put up to keep folks out, and also sometimes the interpretation and application of those rules go along with the spirit of the rules as opposed to the letter of the rules, which is to say racism. My question to you is, where is this happening in linguistics? Are there any proxies, topics, methods, people that are functionally kicked out of linguistics proper under the guise of something else, arguably that something else being those things that are not linguistics? Next, please. So yes, which topics that deal with language is a question that I have. Which topics that deal with language are not linguistics? Which methods of analysis of language are not linguistics? And specifically, to put a finer point on it, within linguistics, who is likely to be interested in the things that are usually denoted as not linguistics? Do they kind of look a certain type of way? Do they typically have a certain type of ambition or agenda? Are there similarities? Do they pattern the same way? What does a narrow view of linguistics afford us? What do we get from that? What does a narrow view of linguistics deprive us? What do we lose for planting our flag on the narrow view? Next, please. These are some of the things that are typically offered as explanations or responses when these types of issues are brought up. I'm sure a lot of us have seen multiple instantiations of these in multiple variations. No, we've never had a Black linguist in our department as a professor, a graduate student, or a colloquium speaker, but we are super open to it. They just have to be or do X, where X is usually like syntax, or a number of other things, neuro, whatever X is, whatever non-thing that is, whatever. I'm not gonna slander folks. We don't do that or can't do sociolinguistics or linguistic anthropology. Now, this in this case is the idea that we have never had and are not specifically interested in doing blanket socio as a topic, because anything that is non-normative within that case is now socio, and we don't do socio, or we can't do socio because we don't have the votes within the department to bring on a socio, so no socio. My social justice work is separate from my linguistics work. So the idea of working with or centering peoples of color, minoritized positionalities, contemporary world events, that is social justice work necessarily as disjoint from linguistics research. And one of my favorites, I've done enough diversity work, which is to say, centering or engaging in minoritized populations is service and can't be research. It's fascinating. Next, please. This is Dave. I'm going to give an example of how the consequences of having those types of frameworks to inform your praxis. This is a picture of Dave. He was one of my participants for my master's research. I wrote on the discourse of conservative student groups, and so I did that work ethnographically on a liberal college campus here in the West Coast. And Dave was one of my participants. This is a picture of him on one of his events. It's a free speech event, right? So he has a sign saying, "Even Nazis deserve free speech." So after the paper, so yeah, more about Dave. Dave was also a former president of the Young Americans for Liberty, which is the libertarian conservative student club on this campus. And so after I had engaged, it was about 2 years after the fact, and I had written the master's thesis, and one of my ethical things was that I was going to give all of the participants a copy of whatever it is that I wrote about them so that we can be in conversation about it, and I wouldn't feel like they would feel confident that I wasn't putting out a hit job or anything like this. So met with him, gave him the thing, and we chatted for a bit. I was like, "So how are things?" He was like, "Oh, it's good. I'm taking a Chicana studies class right now." And I was very excited. "Oh, really cool, Dave. That's awesome. How do you like it?" And he said, it's fine, but I just wish she would be honest that she's just teaching her opinion. Now, I knew this professor, by the way. She happened to be teaching a book from another scholar of language who happens to be in an anthropology department, Norma Mendoza-Denton. So it's teaching her book, and that both the professor and the book could be seen as opinion was an interesting take to me. And after a bit of conversation back and forth, I realized you're hearing it as opinion because you've never taken a class before where whiteness wasn't centered. I did engage him on this point, and he validated. He was like, yeah, it's not that whiteness was centered. It was that it was always unmarked. We never talked about race, therefore white was the way he took it. And this is the first time that he'd ever experienced that not being the case. And so he heard it as opinion. I thought this was fascinating. Next, please. So as a consequence, to many students, unmarked content sounds like objectivity, and marked content sounds like opinion. So whereas only scholars who have, quote, relevant identities should avow them, and whereas relevant identities overlap with marginalized identities and positionalities, therefore those scholars who are functionally teaching and researching from nowhere may be undermining marginalized instructors who must teach from somewhere. What I mean by this is when it is the case that you pretend to not have a body, to not be teaching from and seeing from somewhere, that you don't have experiences, and those experiences don't influence what you read, how you teach, and how you research, you are actively undermining your colleagues who do not have that privilege. They are not able to say that they don't speak from anywhere because their students can see them. And this is a problem. So it may be the case that you're training your students to see the content and to hear the content that your marginalized colleagues teach and the research that they do as opinion and not information and knowledge based on their comparison with you. We just want to be mindful of that. Students may hear, as a last point, a professor speaking from a subjective stance and dismiss that content as opinion. Next, please. As a part of encouragement, last slide, everyone has a positionality. We all have lived experiences. We all have identities. Those identities are normative or non-normative based on how we move throughout the world and which context we're in, and that's okay. Your positionality can and should be a resource in your teaching, your research, and your curriculum. And authors who don't avow their positionality in their work still, in fact, speak from somewhere. Engaging in your own positionality can give license to your students and your peers to exist within linguistics. And it also enriches your research by overtly situating it into a context because it is contextualized. And also, as a closing point, there's room for this in linguistics, right? It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be people engaging overtly with the moment, with people marginalized or otherwise, or not. We can do both of these things. And I think having to choose between one is a false choice. Next slide, please. And thank you. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions in the Q&A period, and we'll pass it on to my awesome colleague, Kendra Calhoun, who will close us out.
So thank you to my presenters, co-presenters, Jamal and DeAndre. This will be the last session for this, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. So my name is Kendra Calhoun. I'm also a graduate student in linguistics at UC Santa Barbara. And I'm going to be talking about graduate students and the graduate curriculum. So as far as what I'll be talking about, I'm going to be focusing on why graduate students are crucial to efforts to diversify the linguistics curriculum, and this applies, of course, in linguistics, but in academia in general. Graduate students' unique position within academia relative to undergraduates and faculty, how that impacts the graduate linguistics curriculum, what we think of as curriculum, and how we go about trying to change it. And then the last part will be some critical reflection questions and some examples from my own experiences. So a key question that inspired me to think about this from the perspective of a graduate student, besides being a graduate student, was thinking about what are our next steps when our efforts to diversify undergraduate curricula successfully attract more underrepresented students to graduate linguistics program. Basically, what are we going to do once we have the people in the room that we're trying to get into the room? And there's a major undergraduate focus in curriculum initiatives in general, for good reason. There are no linguistics faculty or grad students without linguistics undergrads, and I say linguistics broadly speaking, people doing language study. And if we're trying to change the dynamics and the demographics of the field, we obviously can't do that without addressing the largest population within the field. So none of this is to say that it's more important to talk about graduate students and undergrads, but that it's equally important to be thinking about both groups. And as our title implies, graduate students are students too. So if we're talking about making the linguistics curriculum more inclusive of all students, if we're not including graduate students in that conversation, then that conversation is incomplete. So I'll be talking about where and how graduate students fit into efforts to diversify curriculum. What are our specific roles within linguistics departments and academia more broadly? By our, here, or we. Sometimes I'll be talking just about grad students and sometimes about linguists and academics more broadly. And how are we as grad students different from, but also inseparable from undergraduates and faculty? So now I'll get more into the specific role of graduate students and the graduate linguistics curriculum. As Jamal was just talking about, it's always important that we talk about our own positionality and how that informs kind of how we see the world and what we talk about. So a number of factors informing what I'm going to be talking about today. First and foremost, being my own experiences as a Black woman in higher ed, as an interdisciplinary researcher, but particularly one who was not a linguistics undergraduate. I studied English and psychology in undergrad. I didn't major or minor in linguistics. I'm currently a grad student in a linguistics department at a research university in the US, so all of that context is very important. And as far as my educational trajectory, I'm the first person in my family to pursue a PhD, but I'm not the first person with a graduate degree. My older sister has a master's degree. My parents were both first generation in their families to go to college, but I was not a first generation undergraduate student. Additionally, this is informed by research on diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. That includes my own dissertation research and the large body of diversity research that others have conducted. And additionally, many, many insights that I've gained through conversations with gracious and brilliant academic colleagues, including my co-presenters and many people, other grad students at UCSB and in other departments who've been really amazing sharing their time and their insights with me. So, as I mentioned before, graduate students are crucial to curriculum initiatives for a number of reasons. One is that we're still learning linguistics while we're teaching linguistics, which might initially sound like it could be a drawback or a detriment, but actually what that means is that we have perspectives on both undergraduate and graduate curriculum as both students and instructors. And so that's different from faculty who are teaching linguistics. Additionally, many early career graduate students, so thinking like first, second, maybe third year students, are going to be closer in age to undergraduates, especially if we think like a fourth or fifth year senior and a first year master's student. Like there's probably not going to be that much of an age difference between them. And so that means they have more recent experiences of being a linguistics undergraduate or an undergraduate in general. And those are important insights as we're thinking about how can we make undergraduate linguistics courses more relevant, more inclusive for kind of how education is today, right now. So more reasons why graduate students are really important. A lot of us, especially in like a research university context, we're going to have more face time with a wider variety of undergraduates relative to faculty because we're teaching assistants, we're graduate instructors, we're research supervisors, we might attend events on campus, so students see us in sort of a wider variety of contexts. And this means that we're hearing and seeing undergraduate successes and struggles and feedback as far as coursework and just, college in general. We're getting that in real time. And oftentimes, because of that more face time, and again, because we might be closer in age, there are going to be things that undergraduates feel more comfortable talking to a graduate student about that they wouldn't feel comfortable sharing with a professor or maybe in their course reviews at the end of the term. Even more reasons, future faculty are current graduate students. So it's important that we start to establish inclusive teaching practices early and we can start creating change right now, because that means that, for those of us who go on to become faculty, we're going to be adapting to whatever our current context is rather than having to start from scratch or overhaul what we learned or sort of self-taught if we didn't have a lot of pedagogical instruction. Additionally, as a group, we're younger and more diverse than current linguistics faculty, especially senior faculty. We're often more politically progressive in thinking about diversity and inclusion in new and critical ways. So again, these really important perspectives that can help to change or to make the changes that people are striving for as far as changing the curriculum in the field as a whole. So graduate students, as to use DeAndre's terminology, wear many different hats. And that creates this very unique kind of position for us within higher ed. So we're students, as I said before, but we're more advanced than undergraduates. We're researchers, but we're in training still, right? That's why we're in grad school. We're considered less skilled than faculty, but at the same time, we're expected to be experts in whatever our topic area is by a certain point. For those of us who teach, we're teachers, but again, we're still in training because we have less experience than faculty. But even though we're supposed to be in training, oftentimes there's little actual explicit pedagogical training given to graduate students. And additionally, we're supposed to be professionals, right? We're supposed to be going out into the world, telling people about our work, but we're still in need of professionalization from the time we enter graduate school to the time we, graduate and beyond to whatever we do next. And so what this means as far as the graduate linguistics curriculum is that it has to be about more than just classes. And what we think about as, class content has to be expanded as well. And so if diversifying curriculum is a strategy to make linguistics as a field more inclusive for all students, then at the graduate level, that means we're going to have to address all of these different aspects of the graduate linguistics curriculum. So oftentimes when people think about curriculum, we're thinking about courses, classes. What are we teaching in a classroom? So for linguistics at the graduate level, this would include things like content courses, something like sociolinguistics, phonology, morphology, a seminar on a specific topic, generally where we read research, talk with the faculty instructor and our peers, and then write a paper at the end. We also have research methods courses, things like ethnography, experimental phonetics, computational methods, where again, we're reading about the research, talking about it with other people in the class, doing whatever that specific method is, and then usually also writing a paper at the end. Things that oftentimes people don't think of as part of the curriculum, but actually are in fact part of the curriculum, so much so that they're referred to as the hidden curriculum. This is essentially professionalization. And so oftentimes people talk about this or think about this as extracurricular when really it's inseparable from everything else that we're doing as graduate students. And so this includes things like developing a research program, presenting our research and networking, right? Like why do we go to conferences? What are we supposed to be doing there? How do we publish our research? Where do we publish? What is that process like? Pedagogical development. Again, how do we become good teachers? Mentoring and supervising activities. How do I get research assistants? What are ethical ways of assigning work and compensating them for that work? What's our relationship supposed to be like? doing outreach and community activities, doing service activities. What does that look like? How can I make it fit with my research? How do I balance time? Getting money, which is always a big one if we want to be able to do our research, right? How do we apply for fellowships and grants and other awards? And then preparing for the job market, whether that's academic or elsewhere, like how do we be good candidates for jobs that we want to get? So as far as the curriculum, if we want the curriculum to be inclusive, that means that none of it should be hidden. And what we talk about as hidden curriculum particularly disadvantages first generation students, so people who were first generation as undergraduates or graduate students, underrepresented students of color, who are often first generation students, low income students, again, oftentimes underrepresented students of color, oftentimes first generation students, but also international students who might be less familiar with US institutional practices. If they didn't come through as undergrads, there are going to be some things that beyond just a hidden curriculum, they're just not familiar with sort of how US institutions operate. And so what this all means is that if we're recruiting and admitting students from more diverse backgrounds and exist in the field right now, that has to be accompanied by structural changes. And so this is what I mean when I'm talking about changes in the curriculum. And that's to ensure equitable classroom and research and professionalization experiences across the board for everyone who's coming through a program, whatever their research interests are. So the next part of this is just going to be a few different, well, more than a few, a series of critical reflections on inclusive graduate curriculum. And this is meant primarily as an exercise in critical reflexivity, not me giving specific answers, but similar to Jamal's presentation, you can be thinking about what are the answers for your own department or program? And if you don't know the answers, why is that? Or maybe who can you ask or turn to try to get that information? So I'm first going to introduce these questions so you all can be thinking about them, and then I'll come back to each one individually with some examples and context from my own experience. So first, in thinking about graduate coursework, which students' major interests are represented in available courses and whose aren't? And by that, I'm essentially asking, can all of the students who are in your program get the key or the foundational theoretical knowledge that they need in order to do their research through your department? Second, which graduate courses are required and which courses are optional? And if you have courses that can be waived, which ones are those? And why is it the case that those can be waived and others can't? And I should say here that I know coursework, there's always the caveat of like what can be offered depends on how many faculty you have, those faculty's area of research expertise. So there's not the expectation that every department or every program is going to be offering the same courses, of course. But based on kind of what your department or program is able to do, what does this look like? Next, how are the courses actually structured and what type of prior knowledge is assumed in the way that these courses are taught? And since we're in linguistics, what language requirements are there? And what are their justifications as far as like what types of languages are acceptable? What are the forms of assessment and things like that? So to come back to each of these with some examples, as far as the courses that are, or the research areas that are represented in the courses that are offered, for people particularly doing interdisciplinary research, of course, there's multiple disciplines, so we might not necessarily be able to get everything in their own department. So in my case, I took extra courses outside of my department to supplement what was offered in the department. But for anyone who does that, that means extra work and extra time, right? They're extra courses, especially if you're taking them for credit, and that can affect time to degree. And so in my case, I took 7 extra courses for credit and then some other ones that I audited. And this was, informative. I wanted to take these classes, but it was also really necessary in some cases because we didn't have a graduate language and race course, and that's a key part of my research. So I was taking courses on race through Black Studies and sociology and some other departments. And so that was really helpful, and it's really informed my research, but 7 extra courses is a lot of extra courses. As far as the courses that are required and which ones are optional, kind of a common setup is that maybe theoretical or structural courses are required for all students, and socio courses, kind of broadly speaking, if they're offered in the department, are optional, or maybe only like 1 is required. As far as how courses are structured, and what prior knowledge is assumed? This is an important question from my perspective as someone who, again, was not a linguistics undergraduate. I took linguistics courses through English, through psychology, and I took intro and survey linguistics courses, so I got kind of most of the subfields, but I didn't necessarily take a subfield specific course for everyone. And so in my case, when I was in graduate school, I had to take an advanced phonology course without having ever taken an undergraduate phonetics or phonology course, which meant I was doing a lot of independent study and asking my wonderful peers for lots of help, and they were very gracious. Because of the way that the scheduling worked out, I had planned to take the undergraduate courses at UCSB, but they ended up being taught after the graduate course, which, it just happened. But this is important to think about that, as we're designing these courses, if someone is coming in, maybe not necessarily in that exact position, but if they just don't have a linguistics background in the same way as someone who studied linguistics or a language, how are they going to fare in our courses? Are we teaching it in a way that's giving everyone the same sort of baseline information from the beginning, not assuming that they have that baseline knowledge from the beginning? As far as language requirements, thinking about what are the requirements for students who already know multiple languages, since that's often the case, particularly for international students, people who come from multilingual homes, but also what options are available for students if they need to take language courses in order to meet whatever your language requirements are. And are they going to be penalized for, again, the extra work and time that it's going to take away from their other degree requirements in order to meet those language requirements? So in my case, I took 5 quarters of undergraduate language courses in order to get my 2 languages up to speed for our language requirements. And at UCSB, undergraduate language courses up through, I think, level 3 or 4, I forget exactly which one, but they meet 4 times a week. So they're fairly time intensive. And so it's important to think about which types of students are going to be most likely to be in this position. It's going to be students who don't come from multilingual homes, students who came from schools where maybe they didn't have strong language programs, or undergraduate majors that didn't require extensive language. My undergrad required 1 semester of a language class. And students who don't have the means to maybe study abroad or travel or the time to study language on their own. So these are really important factors to be thinking about. So of course, in addition to coursework, we're thinking about teaching. How are faculty modeling inclusive teaching and research practices in both undergraduate and graduate courses? What departmental or institutional resources do graduate students have for pedagogical training? And what opportunities do they have to implement what they learn? As I mentioned before, graduate students are still learning how to teach, and so faculty should be setting a good example. As Jamal talked about, in grad courses, they can be modeling how do we discuss positionality and how it shapes our research and our teaching. And this is especially important for faculty from dominant groups to do this, as Jamal mentioned before. When thinking about department and institutional resources, of course, the linguistics department or program that you're in does not control the teaching and pedagogy resources that are available on campus, but it's important that your students know what options there are if they care about being good teachers and want to seek those resources out. At UCSB, we have a couple of different ones. So we have instructional development, CITDRAW, and our own departmental inclusive curriculum initiative. So as someone who's passionate about teaching, I'm lucky to be in a space where there are actually lots of resources available, but I know that that's not the case at every institution. And so if maybe there are things online or other ways that students can be getting this sort of training, like is the department making sure students know about that? And then coming back to professionalization, how is your department institutionalized professionalization in ways that are accessible to everyone? Meaning how is what we call the hidden curriculum being made explicit and institutionalized in your department? At UCSB, we have a series of professionalism workshops. I believe it's 12 or 13 that are part of our degree requirements. They cover most of the things that I mentioned before, if not all of them. And we're also lucky to have Professor Anchioti Headley, who's been doing a series of actual professionalism seminar courses that really delve deep into these different issues and things that we should be knowing as we prepare to be professionals. But a really important follow-up question to this is, what resources are available for students from minoritized or underrepresented backgrounds that speak to their specific experiences? So if you do have resources, whether it's webinars or workshops or whatever it may be, say about the academic job market, are you giving sort of just blanket information to all students? Or are there discussions happening within that workshop, that class, within the department in general about how race and gender and other identity characteristics or social characteristics impact things like publishing and grants and interviews and hiring for jobs? Because students from different backgrounds do not have access to the same resources or are facing different structural barriers as they navigate higher education. And so it's important that that reality is being talked about so that people are fully prepared and have more equitable access and chances to succeed in higher ed. So all of this is to say that curriculum sends clear messages, those mostly being what type of research do we value most as a department, and what types of students, which can be read as what types of people do we value most. And so depending on what types of research are valued in the department, that influences whether or how students' needs are acknowledged and addressed in the department. And, people talk, departments have reputations. And so that's going to determine what types of graduate students are attracted to certain types of linguistics departments or linguistics at all. And that influences who has graduate PhDs or who has linguistics PhDs and who becomes linguistics faculty. So we're thinking sort of long-term, like what are the stakes of thinking about graduate curriculum? The stakes are pretty high. So it's important that we're being intentional and critical about this at the undergraduate and the graduate level. And a few final questions, courtesy of Professor Ann Charity Headley. If you're admitting Black students or other students from underrepresented backgrounds into your graduate programs, how are you committing to being part of their intellectual communities? And by that, we mean, how are you challenging the dominant expectation for students, for underrepresented students to just assimilate to the existing departmental or hegemonic linguistics culture? Basically, how are you going to make space for students to come into your department as opposed to expecting students to just sort of fight their way in and do what everyone else is doing, as opposed to saying, no, we're going to change so that the space is inclusive for everyone. So thank you for listening. This is all of our information for all of the presenters. And before we head into the Q&A, since our Q&A time is finite, just a couple of things we wanted to pose. In your questions, to please be as specific and concise as possible, but also cognizant of what might be department internal information. We wouldn't want anyone to get in trouble by asking a question. Please avoid very specific, like what should my department do sorts of questions. Those are obviously important discussions to have, but in 10 minutes, it's not necessarily helpful to everyone. We pose lots of questions throughout our discussion, so feel free to follow up on any of those. The always necessary disclaimer, please no comments disguised as questions, but if you do have general comments or general feedback, or we don't get to your question, we're happy to be in conversation with people. You can email or tweet any one of us or all of us, and we're happy to talk more about this.
Great, thank you very much, Kendra, and thanks very much to all of our panelists. If we could have you all back on camera now, we have come to the part of the webinar where the panelists take your questions. So if you haven't done so already, you can ask them now using the questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please let us know which one. Now, I know there was one that came in a while ago for Jamal, and I think you answered the questioner privately, but if you still have that information available, I wonder if you would address it so that everyone could hear.
Absolutely. Want to find the specific question? Yeah, so I'll read it out loud so everyone understands what it is. I wonder if Mr. Muwakil thinks that some kind of introductory activity that highlights the notion of positionality would help foster productive, not sure that what this would mean, critical discussions in courses like those in linguistics. And I say yes. The way that I answered, and I did type a response directly to the question asker. But my thought is that yes, absolutely, that it would be a great first step, doing an introductory activity to acknowledge and represent the idea of positionality as a concept and as a lens through which we will engage with the work. But I'd also kind of build on it and ask that we expand the notion that it's not like a thing you do one time. It's a lens that you deploy onto and against all things that you engage in within linguistics. So your curriculum, the reading that you assign, how does positionality engage with that? Both yours, the students, and the author, and the community that they're engaging with to kind of glean their data. How about you and your relationship with your mentees, graduate students and undergraduates? How does your recommendations for how they would navigate, say, graduate schools, how is that similar or different based on the bodies that you occupy? You can't start to have those types of variegated and nuanced conversations unless you engage with who you are and how your body is situated within greater society and the institutions in which we're engaged. Lest we do that, then we're kind of stuck in just doing performative stuff. And I'd love for us to kind of get away from the performative.
Great, thank you. Here's another question for the panel. Just a moment. Thank you, everyone. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for graduate students to organize undergraduate students to push for changes. I sometimes feel like I don't have much support from above, but a lot of support from below. I'd love to help organize that energy to move towards structural change, and I'd appreciate any tips about how to do this. Any thoughts?
I'll say something real quick and then please follow up, rest of the awesome humans. So I think all of us have a strong history in student activism both in our undergrad and graduate lives. What I might say just contextually is that students have a lot more power than you think. I think it's always a grass is greener frame. When you're an undergrad, you think everyone has power but me, but you're like the most powerful like demographic on campus. And then when you're a graduate student, you're like, I'm not faculty, but I'm also not an undergrad who actually has the power, so I don't have any power. And then I'm sure when you're faculty, you're like, oh, these students, they get to tell us all what to do. So I think that it's, in some sense, it's the grass is greener on the other side, kind of a sense. You have a lot of influence and power to kind of shape and let your desires be known. Some of those can be in, say, graduate affinity groups that outreach and interact with the undergraduate affinity groups. So both myself and DeAndre have both been presidents of the Black Graduate Student Association at UC Santa Barbara. Kendra has been in executive positions for many of her years. Within the BGSA, we interact with the undergraduate Black student organization. We interact with the administration. We write statements, we do demands. So there's that, at least that venue, that access point allows for some more formal engagement with change making through graduate affinity groups, just as an initial thought. I'd love to hear what everyone else has to say.
Yeah, so I might just share a few things. So many campuses with linguistics departments have some sort of undergraduate club or something like that. So it might be prudent to institutionalize, and this isn't necessarily something that can be done without engagement with faculty, but institutionalize one, maybe membership on or either a faculty liaison between that club and the faculty, but in an even better case, institutionalized student representation at the graduate student and undergraduate level at the faculty level, which might look like, and I know maybe many faculty on this call would bristle aggressively at the idea, but that students, undergraduates included, might have a voting voice, an active voice in decisions that are being made that affect undergraduate. And then another way that might utilize this, the kind of power that undergraduates have, might be by interacting through the kind of pool of major students. So you might consider going through, with the I guess permission of maybe some generous faculty member with a listserv to an administrative assistant or administrative professional who has access to all of the undergraduates, maybe either to survey what kinds of things undergraduates are enjoying about the courses that they're taking in the department, things that they're not so much enjoying, and to be able to, really source what kind of things the department can do differently to better serve those students. And then you might also target the students who are underrepresented in the departments to get in a real concrete sense on your campus what the department might do to better serve those students.
Yeah, I don't know if I have too much to add to what's already been said, other than, yeah, I guess finding out where undergraduate and graduate student needs align, or sort of needs that aren't being served. I think oftentimes, yeah, sort of like what Jamal was saying, there are misperceptions about who has power, or so the types of power and influence that students, undergraduate and graduate, can have. And also times a misperception that graduate students don't have the same or similar needs as undergraduates. Like sometimes it might seem like, okay, well, undergrads have to, try and get what they need, and graduate students have to try and get what they need. And maybe in some ways we can, like, numerically people power, trying to help each other, but realizing the ways that those needs are actually interconnected and presenting that to faculty or administrators or whoever it is that has the power to make structural changes, I think is one route to go, just to kind of reiterate what was already said.
Great. Well, thank you all. We've come to the end of the time, and I know there were many of you who weren't able to ask your questions, but please let's continue the conversation. You have the contact information, and Jamal, can you repeat the hashtag?
Yes, hashtag this is linguistics.
This is okay. Hashtag this is linguistics. So let's continue the conversation offline. Many thanks to our panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us. And thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day to be with us. This webinar was recorded. The recording will be available and up on the LSI website no later than Monday, and we'll let you know when it's ready. So thanks again to everybody, and have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye now.